This is Land of Havilah, Zechariah 13. The division of the Bible into chapters goes back to about 1205 A.D. As originally written, there were no chapters or verses, just continuous script, keeping in mind that this is a continuation of the last chapter, verse 1. In that day there will be a spring opened to David's house and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. Comment, in what day? It's the day of mourning from the last chapter, which is either a mourning that the Messiah was crucified or a mourning because the Messiah's mourning. Only the former makes sense in the context of the present chapter, that there's been a recognition that Jesus was the Messiah, and there's mourning over the fact that the Jewish nation crucified him. With that recognition in verse 1, a spring of cleansing is opened. Recognition of the Messiah resulted in cleansing. Quote, everyone who believes in him will receive remission of sins, Acts 10:43. The newly opened spring of cleansing in verse 1 reminds us of the hymn by William Cowper, "There is a fountain filled with blood flowing from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains." Coming up, when that recognition occurs on a wide scale, there will be no more tolerance for idolatry, impurity, and false prophets. Verse 2, "It'll come to pass in that day, says Yahweh of armies, that I'll cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they'll be remembered no more. I'll also cause the prophets and the spirit of impurity to pass out of the land. It'll happen that when anyone still prophesies, then his father and his mother who bore him will tell him, 'You must die because you speak lies in Yahweh's name.' And his father and his mother who bore him will stab him when he prophesies. It'll happen in that day that the prophets will each be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. Neither will they wear a hairy mantle to deceive, but he'll say, 'I'm no prophet, I'm a tiller of the ground, for I've been made a bondservant from my youth.' One will say to him, 'What are these wounds between your arms?' Then he'll answer, 'Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends.'" Comment, in verses 2 to 6, the prophets being discussed are false prophets because in verse 2, Yahweh will purge them from the land along with idols and the spirit of impurity. And in verse 3, they speak lies, and in verse 4, they deceive. In verse 3, there'll be such an intolerance of false prophecy in that day and such a recognition of the destructiveness of it that the parents of a false prophet will be so enraged they'll stab him. This is according to the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 18:20, that the penalty for false prophecy is death. In verse 4, false prophets wore a hairy mantle to deceive. Apparently this was in imitation of Elijah. Elijah didn't have a hairy mantle exactly, but he did wear a mantle, which was a sign of his office, and it was transferable, 1 Kings 19:19. And he had an unusual amount of body hair, 2 Kings 1:8, so a false prophet wore a hairy mantle to imitate a real prophet, namely Elijah, who commanded such awesome respect not in Israel in his own lifetime, but in Judah afterward. In verse 5, no one in the coming day will be so recklessly ambitious as to claim to be a prophet. If anyone's accused of prophesying, he'll loudly protest, "I'm only a farm laborer, that's it." Everyone will recognize false prophecy for the heinous crime that it is and not dare to prophesy unless God commands him. In verse 6, regarding the wounds between the arms, the location of the wounds is in question because of translation issues. It's translated in your hands, between your hands, on your back, and on your chest. If it's in your hands, it would remind us of Jesus, but that doesn't fit because the wounded man is the farm laborer being accused of prophesying. And this is an era of righteousness, not an era of deep darkness as it was in Jesus' day. The prophet's friends attacked him because even they wouldn't have his false prophecy. It's apparent in this passage that God's highly irritated when he's falsely represented. Now, speaking of another era, not an era of righteousness, but an era when Yahweh will cut off a majority of the people and rehabilitate the rest, verse 7, "Awake, sword, against my shepherd and against the man who's close to me, says Yahweh of armies. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, and I'll turn my hand against the little ones." Comment, Yahweh's calling for a sword against his own shepherd. Yahweh calls the shepherd my shepherd, a man who's close to me, which is Christ. Jesus' own commentary on this verse was that He was the shepherd who would be struck, and his disciples were the sheep who would be scattered. Mark 14:27. The disciples scattered when Jesus was arrested. Quote, then all the disciples left him and fled. Matthew 26:56. And the verse says Yahweh will turn his hand against the little ones, or insignificant ones, it's also translated. Jesus said to his disciples, they'll deliver you up to oppression and will kill you. Matthew 24:9. He also said Jerusalem would be besieged, overthrown, the buildings torn down, with the inhabitants and their children dashed to the ground. Luke chapter 19, which was fulfilled in 70 A.D. by the Roman legions. So Yahweh's hand against the little ones or insignificant ones could be against the disciples or against the occupants of Jerusalem. Speaking of that day of destruction, verse 8, it shall happen that in all the land, says Yahweh, 2 parts in it will be cut off and die, but the 3rd part will be left in it. Comment, it's either translated left in it or left alive. When the Romans broke into the city, they killed many or most of the people and deported the rest as slaves. Speaking of the smaller part that was left alive or left in it, verse 9, I'll bring the 3rd part into the fire and will refine them as silver is refined, and will test them like gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I'll hear them. I'll say, it is my people, and they'll say, Yahweh is my God. Comment, Yahweh says, I'll bring the 3rd part, which is the survivors, into the fire and refine them. They'll call on Yahweh's name, and he'll call them my people. The Jews have been through the fire for almost 2,000 years, but according to Paul, all Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26. They've been through the fire, but will be saved. Your narrator isn't saying that these are the only fulfillments and applications of these verses, but according to the history of God's people, which has transpired since Zechariah wrote this, and according to the prophetic timeline of the future as your narrator understands it, the interpretations he's given are the best he knows. Zechariah 14 is next.